FBI hate crime statistics recently came out, and I think one of the key pieces of data that I think was not necessarily underscored, but is as critical, is that in multiple cities that have over 100,000 in population either reported zero hate crimes or didn't report hate crimes at all.
The heat map stands for hate, extremism, anti-Semitism, and terror. And it's an interactive map made up of 6 different data sets, which at this point includes over 18,000 points on a map that enables people to visualize the threat of extremism and hatred and anti-Semitism. In order to address extremism and hate, it's really important to have the data available so people can create new laws or regulations that help mitigate the threats of extremism and hate.
We believe sunlight is the best disinfectant. You need to expose the extremists, you need to expose the hate so that people can frankly understand what they're up against and do something about it.
Good afternoon and welcome back to Never Is Now, ADL's signature summit on anti-Semitism and hate. I am Cheryl Drazen, ADL's Vice President of the Central Division, and I am pleased to be the moderator for this afternoon's CLE session, The Stories the Numbers Tell. We want to be in conversation with you during this panel, so please don't forget to ask questions by clicking on the Q&A button that you'll find at the right of the video. Please type questions throughout our panel, and we'll select a few to ask the panelists after the initial discussion is complete. Please let me introduce today's speakers. From the National Black Justice Coalition, we have Victoria Kirby York, Deputy Executive Director. From Unidos US, we are joined by Clarissa Martinez de Castro, who's their Deputy Vice President. And we are thrilled to have John Yang with us, the President and Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice. Now, I won't go through their full distinguished bios, but you can find them all on our website, neverisnow.org, on the speakers page. I want to offer a short course before we dive into conversation with our panelists, because ADL has been a long-time leader in combating hate crimes. We created the model hate crime legislation in America, which is now found in 46 states and the District of Columbia, based on our model. We have held a large number of organizations in coalition that ultimately spearheaded the passage of the Shepard-Byrd Hate Crimes Act, which passed in 2009. So just 12 years ago, last month, we had a National Hate Crimes Act. Now, the Shepard-Byrd Act is connected to ADL's Central Division, where I'm sitting, because the tragic deaths of James Byrd in June 1998 occurred in Texas, and the devastating death of Matthew Shepard, October 1998, in Wyoming. And again, that act signed in 2009 is just a teenager by legal standards, only 12 years old. So when we think about hate crimes, let's be on the same page. These are crimes that occur because of a perpetrator's bias or animus against the victim on the basis of actual or perceived status, the victim's race, their religion, their national origin, gender identity, sexual orientation, or disability. It's a crime where a person is targeted because of an immutable, protected characteristic. Now, if you heard bells and whistles going off when the FBI reported the 2020 hate crime statistics recently, you weren't hearing things. You should have been alarmed. The data showed the largest number of hate crimes that we have seen in decades. The trends were disturbing. Race-based hate crimes remained the plurality and the majority against the African American community, but a 49% increase over the previous year. Crimes against the AAPI community surged, up almost 60% over previous years. Crimes remained high against the Latinx community, and we continue to see increased crimes focused on gender identity. More and more disturbing. Now, our panelists will go into detail about the difference between hate crimes and hate incidents, but let's just lay the ground straight. The Supreme Court has held that hate crimes are real crimes. For more than 2 decades, the United States Supreme Court has held that there is a meaningful distinction between punishing the content of speech and evidence as a motive in a crime. So it seems simple enough, even though there's a real disparity in state laws that don't cover all immutable characteristics. Some omit sexual orientation, many omit gender identity or expression, and some completely ignore disability. And we won't have time, candidly, to go into all of those distinctions today, but it's important to understand that we're not talking about the same law in every state. But when we are talking about the federal law, the Byrd-Shepard Act, we also have to look at the Hate Crime Statistics Act. It was passed in 1990 and then modified in 2009 with the Shepard-Byrd Act. And it requires the U.S. Attorney General to collect data on crimes. That report I just talked about came through the Statistics Act. That data appears annually in the FBI Hate Crimes Report, which is part of the Uniform Crimes Report. And as a practical matter, though, the Hate Crime Statistics Act doesn't require law enforcement to report, begging the questions, how do we track numbers if reporting is really voluntary? So a quick review of annual data shows that an alarming number of municipalities, big cities throughout our country, are reporting no hate crimes or failing to report at all. So as a takeaway, hate crimes are real and they have real impact, because when one individual is targeted by a hate crime, the entire community experiences a level of impact. And as we've seen throughout this conference, we live in a data-driven world. We are drawn to numbers to explain trends, and we might even rely on them to inform our own understanding, to shape our responses. But if the underlying data is not accurate, what good is it? And are we misleading ourselves about what's really going on in our very own communities? So if data drives policy, and without having a complete picture of the problem, we can't even begin to resolve the issues driving a surge in hatred and in violence. But lucky for us, we have leaders in the field to help us unpack this conundrum. Now, I know that some of you may have joined us for CLE Credit, so I want everyone to know that anyone seeking credit today, there's going to be codes that will appear in the program in the Q&A box found to the right of your screen. If you're viewing from a computer or tablet, or at the bottom of your screen if you're watching today's presentation on a phone. I will announce those codes when they display, and they'll only appear briefly, so get them down because you're going to need to record them for your attendance. You'll be asked to provide those codes in the CLE credit form you'll fill out post the session. So let's get started with a conversation. I want to focus, Victoria and John, first on barriers to reporting. It is given that hate crimes are vastly underreported at 2 key decision points: by communities to police, and by police to the FBI. And they said I could only have an hour of your time today. So I want us to dig into the former, underreporting by victims. Why are communities maybe not sharing? And the corollary is disturbing, because the very people who are most likely to be targeted by hate crimes, those who live in marginalized communities, may be the very least likely to report them to law enforcement. So Victoria, I'm going to throw the first question to you. How does the reality of what happens when someone does report a hate crime to police, the way they're treated, affect whether others in their community are going to report in the future?
That's a great question. And it unfortunately is so similar to many other crimes that we experience underreporting in, whether you're talking about harassment or assault that takes place. And there's a common thread when it comes to each of these types of crime types. One is for many marginalized communities, especially those who sit at intersections of multiple marginalized communities. NBJC represents Black LGBTQ plus and same gender loving folks as an example. This kind of mistreatment can sometimes feel as regular as breathing or as regular as brushing your teeth. And so when you look at even some of the smaller types of crimes, right? Being in a store, in a parking lot, and someone decides to pick a fight or start a fight with you, and you thankfully don't lose your life over it, but you are scarred by the language, that's being hurled at you, and it's very clear that the fight was picked because of the fact that you're holding your partner's hand and that partner happens to be same gender like my wife is, or because of the color of your skin, or as mentioned, because you are disabled or differently abled. Those kinds of experiences, including name calling, including people throwing things at you on a bus, some of these experiences that lead up to some of the moments that you can't come back from, like murder, in the case of both Matthew Shepard, James Byrd, and so many others, um, are paved by a number of experiences that you just learn to live with, right? And unfortunately, no one should be forced to live with the kind of pain that's inflicted by both hate crimes and also hate incidences. Disbelief. People believe that, well, if I tell my story, what makes it special or different, right? And it's like, actually, what happened to you shouldn't happen to anyone. And in order to change the narrative regarding justice and accountability, we have to have people feel like they are worth the fight that's going to take place. And too many people don't feel like they are worth the fight because of years of being marginalized, excluded, and feeling as though, well, I'm a minority, or, I come from this discriminated against community. That's just par for the course of being who I am. You also see the lack of response and follow up. So for people who do take the initiative to file that hate crime report, and you don't hear back from the local law enforcement agent, or you feel like every time you provide more evidence or more information, what you have to say doesn't have weight or value, the less likely you are to continue to go and push to get your case heard. And the people who hear your story are also less likely to then file a report when it happens to them. Like, well, if my friend or my aunt or my father complained and nothing happened, to help get justice for them, why would they provide justice to me? And then there's the lack of empathy, lack of understanding, lack of shared language or cultural competency that occurs when you make it to that police station, or even when you talk to an attorney to get support. And people, particularly in the LGBTQ community, getting stuck when they're like, oh, it's a transgender person, I don't know what to say, or, ooh, I hope I don't mess up in talking about this person and their loved one. And the lack of cultural competency training and understanding, and even understanding of language, becomes a barrier to being able to actually have the kind of justice we all deserve.
Thanks, Victoria. Clarissa, I want to go into particularly the police interaction part of the challenge that Victoria touched on. Can you help us understand what the effect of police interaction challenges could have on a community's willingness to engage in reporting at all?
I think Victoria touched on actually three elements I was going to mention, but she captured it so beautifully. At the core of it is worth, right? Who is perceived as being worthy? And at some point in many of our communities, it's not necessarily that we don't think we are worthy, but that we have a perception that if those who would guard against abuse do not consider us worthy, then is it worth the time to go through with the reporting? And is anything going to be done about it? In many ways, I think it is similar to the path we had to walk in understanding domestic violence. For a very long time, I think where law enforcement is concerned, domestic violence was seen as, hey, this is a private matter between individuals. They have to work it out themselves. And there had to be a lot of learning both from the from the victim involved, as well as the law enforcement agencies who would have to intervene. So there's a lot of similarities here for the communities that see themselves as targets of hate crimes. Is a continued effort by group ADL in partnership with many of us to really educate community organizations and individuals, members of communities, about what hate crimes are and the need to report them and why that matters. Then on the law enforcement side, I think there is also a need to more deeply understand how patterns that point to the most egregious and violent acts that then we all mourn and communities suffer from. So what are those early signals that we are missing, but that would allow us to interrupt from something getting to tragic violence if we are able to pick up on it early enough. So it's a both end, is working with communities who see themselves as targets to continue that reading process and not let up, even if it feels like right now it's not getting all the attention it deserves, and working with law enforcement to more deeply understand that how to act and interrupt patterns will lead to more tragic consequences.
Thank you, Clarissa. John, it is always hard to be the third question in a series of questions when Victoria and Clarissa have given us so much. But what institutional and systemic barriers to reporting do you observe that we haven't talked about in just a victim's ability to access the system and report?
Thanks for that question. And let me approach it from the Asian American perspective. And when I think about sort of the systemic barriers that we have, one would revolve around language, two would revolve around education, and three would revolve around our interactions with law enforcement. First, around language, it's important to recognize that about 2/3 of the Asian American population are immigrants. Literally, they came from another country. About 1/3 of our population are what we would call limited English proficient. In other words, our ability to navigate in the English language is limited. So if you think about that and sort of how they are even able to report a hate crime or hate incidents, there's a limiting factor right there. So whether it is law enforcement, a health department, or any other institution that is able to take a report of a hate crime, if they don't have the capacity to operate in those different languages, that's going to be an automatic barrier. And then for the Asian American community, it's important to remember, that community is incredibly diverse. We're talking over 50 different races and ethnicities, over 100 different languages. So trying to make sure that all of them have the resources to access, the points that we need is going to be a concern. Second is education. I think both Victoria and Clarissa touched on this, is how much does our community, our respective communities, understand what a hate crime is, what is actionable, what will happen when a report is filed. And the reality is not much has been done for, I think I could speak for both Victoria and Clarissa, for our communities in reaching out to our communities so that our communities understand that, right? And so if we don't understand why reporting is important, then we're not going to do it. And then the third piece is that interaction with law enforcement. And here I do want to emphasize that the Asian American community has some of the same concerns as the African American and Latino community. Oftentimes, I think people sometimes think about this dynamic between law enforcement sometimes as an African American issue and a Latino issue. It absolutely is, but it's also an Asian American issue. If you think about specifically how our Vietnamese community or our Laotian community, Hmong community interact with law enforcement, or our South Asian American, the Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, South Asian American community, those places have been fraught with tensions as well. So what is the likelihood that those communities would want to come out and talk to law enforcement, even in these contexts? The last thing I would probably mention and want to make sure that people understand is the scope of this problem in terms of how much underreporting there is. That FBI report that you referenced suggested that there was a vast increase of hate crimes against Asian Americans. Absolutely, that's correct. But that FBI report, I think, reported only 279 hate crimes. So already that number sounds wrong. But then if you look at the DOJ survey on the National Criminalization Victim Survey, I'm not sure if I got that name right. That shows that several thousand Asian Americans have suffered from hate crimes. So now we've gotten one level up. Data from our own community, my organization, as well as an organization called Stop AAPI Hate, try to track hate crimes and hate incidents. So I admit we're conflating those two issues. But even in the last 20 months alone, we've tracked over 10,000 anti-Asian incidents. And then lastly, if you look at Pew Research or Ipsos Research, 30% of Asian Americans have said that they have suffered racial incidents in this past year. 30% of the Asian American population will be 6 million Asian Americans. So when we're talking about the scope of this problem, and I would venture to say that this is true for all of our vulnerable communities, the scope is really large, and how we have to address this has to be commensurate with the size of the problem.
Thank you so much, John, for putting that in perspective. Well, with the overwhelming information you just shared, I guess I want to flip to the other side. Our organizations have worked together for a good while to try to be problem solvers. So there have to be solutions to overcoming these barriers. And your organizations are among the forefront of the leaders making change. So it seems to me like some of the root causes are systemic, and probably in the rest of the hour, we won't be able to fix that. But I wonder if we can flip the equation and look at it from the other side. The process, the way that people report hate crimes, are there other ways that we could be attacking this as society, that we could lessen those burdens that communities face? Throughout the country, it's kind of exciting. We're starting to see some alternative reporting suggestions, mechanisms being proposed at a local, maybe even at a state level. I don't think we have any huge success stories that we can go shout from mountaintops. We fixed the problem and here's the right way to go. But we are seeing movement in communities. And you've laid out the challenges. So if you can give us a little bit of hope, what are the opportunities as practical measures that we can address obstacles with? And Victoria, I'll ask the easy question first. Are there alternative mechanisms that could work better for victims?
Yes, there are. I'm so excited. You know, we've all worked together in pushing Congress to pass both the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, which I know we'll talk about more a little later, and the Jabara Higher Hate Crimes Act, which was passed as an amendment. And one of the reporting mechanisms baked into Jabara Higher are being able to support state and local communities and having hotlines, numbers folks can call. I know here in Maryland, we use 311 if we need some support from our county government to get something done. You know, I had this huge scary tree in my backyard. All I do is quickly dial 311 and put in that report. And you know, finally they came and took care of it. That having easy hotlines like that, where if something happens, you can dial. Allows you to have someone you can talk to about what happened, help you process. Because one of the other things is after a hate crime, you're rattled, right? Like you're trying to gather your thoughts. You know, depending on what happened to you, you might be in physical pain, you might be in the hospital, you might be experiencing mental anguish. There's a lot going on, and going straight into calling 911 adds its own kind of layer, especially for all the reasons John highlighted with the last question. And so these hotlines provide, prayerfully provide people who have been trained and can help guide people as they're still processing everything that's going on in their bodies and in their minds and spirits. Text programs are really innovative in addition to that for folks to be able to send off a text message to begin the process. Social media messaging, being able to slide into local law enforcement's DMs, so to speak, to get the process going, to start having a conversation, whether it's with law enforcement or some other broader public safety personnel like a social worker, therapist, or some other kind of person helping to serve as that in between. And also being able to provide opportunities for local community groups to really stand in the gap and to receive funding support, and being able to be trusted messengers, and sharing what the process is for folks, and being able to also help publicize hotlines and all these other kinds of methods folks can navigate to be able to get justice.
Thank you, Victoria. Those are exciting opportunities that sound like maybe there is some hope. John, we are joined today by a lot of attorneys, but a lot of people for this panel from across the country, East Coast to West Coast, North to South. Tell us what else you're seeing at a state or local level that's catching your eye, catching your constituencies as saying, I might actually do that, or I would try that if it were available to me.
Yeah. And Victoria's touched on this, is that investing in local communities is part of the solution. I have seen legislation, whether it's in California or other places, that have really given grants to local communities to be part of that reporting process. Because the reality is, for many of our communities, the first place that they're going to go is not going to be the police department. It's going to be their local community health center, the people that they know, because those people also have those language capacities, the cultural capacities. So if those community health centers are more integrated with our government facilities, and they know know how to identify a hate crime, know how to process it, then we get both a more robust reporting system, but then we are also in a position that we're able to help the victim so much more. Because I'll admit, for me, data drives solutions, but then ultimately those solutions have to center around that victim and making sure the victim is getting the type of support that they need. So that's one place that I really see some legislation going in an interesting direction. The other thing I would say is, with respect to these hotlines, I think that's right. It's interesting to see these develop. I will offer some cautionary tales. For example, and I may get some flack for this, but like when the New York Attorney General rolled out her hotline, very well intentioned, but for our community, it didn't really hit the right way, because the question immediately arises, okay, I'm reporting to law enforcement about this, what happens, right? And especially for our community, that's an immigrant community, if they have immigration issues, that's going to cause them to push back or pull back from reporting, because they're afraid that somehow they're going to have to reveal their immigration status. So there has to be some intentionality with that rollout of these hotlines. I agree that that is definitely a device that we need to be exploring, but we need to think about who is it that's hosting it, how it is messaged about who is receiving the information, the confidentiality of that information, so that people have a comfort. Frankly, if it's rolled out so that the community groups are part of that rollout process, as Victoria said, as trusted messengers, that will go a long way towards addressing some of these concerns that our community groups have had, when some of these initiatives have been undertaken.
No pushback from me, John. I think being able to tell what's actually working on the ground is super, super important. Victoria, did you want to jump in?
Yes, well, I just 100% agree with that. Like the way it's implemented is incredibly important, and also learning from other states, right? So as more states are rolling this out, my hope is that they're going to be in communication with each other regularly, so that folks can learn from each other, share best practices, share language, share language, share language in different languages. Look at all of those repeated words. Um, that can help ensure that as more systems roll out, they're getting fine-tuned and better as they go on. Because it's one thing for a system to have flaws and to stay that way, and then another thing for community members to see that there is true intention in working with community members to get it right. And that also helps to build trust. And then one thing that came up for me, and I know Clarissa is about to speak too, I just I actually hadn't thought about this before, and it may be something that's happening, but being able to have confidential support groups that are housed in these community partners, organizations, but have a relationship with the right offices in terms of being able to file hate crimes, can create a good buffer space, right? There are some people who may never want to file a hate crime, right? And hopefully later I'll get a chance to talk about restorative justice and why that's important in some of our communities. But some people may not want that, but they do need to talk to someone about it. They need to feel validated. And also community support groups can help give people that extra umph when they do share their story, to be able to say, you know what happened to me was wrong. And I personally deserve accountability and justice. And I want to make sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else from this particular perpetrator, right? And community support groups can help to foster that in the same ways that, they're used to help folks battling with alcoholism. When you attend an AA meeting, or some other kind of meeting that helps to provide emotional support, but in this case can also help provide the confidence needed to file that report as well.
No, super, super helpful, Victoria. And I guess because you're right, I do want to bring Clarissa into the conversation also. And if I'm weaving a theme through what you and John have shared so much is, as advocates, we often design amazing opportunities that we think will work flawlessly because there's a flow chart, there's a great PR campaign that could go with it. But it's what communities need. I mean, if we're really trying to get our marginalized communities to participate. Clarissa, I'm gonna leave kind of the $1 million question in your lap, which is what kinds of approaches could help us get communities centered in the conversation about how we create a reporting process that works for them, not necessarily that works for the data geeks like me who are collecting the numbers.
Yeah, I usually like to start with the basics. Unidos US, we have a network of community-based organizations who work in a variety of, some in education, economic development, housing, health, and as folks have mentioned, is these communities or community organizations, regardless of whether they work on a particular thing, that people normally go to seeking information. It would be unrealistic to expect that community organizations who the community trusts for, if they go there for one thing, chances are they're going to go there and ask about a lot of other things. It is unrealistic to expect that any one organization is going to become an expert on everything, right? And so we often think through the lens of, okay, what could help an organization that is going to face questions or receive questions from the community at least provide something without them having to get a PhD or all of a sudden becoming an expert on science. And there's some simple things. Creating easy and accessible, culturally competent checklist, right? What is a hate crime? Easy, simple, that's not complicated. What is that description? If you have been or have witnessed a hate crime, what do? Here are the 5 things you do. Here's what you do. Here's who you call. Here's the information you provide. I think starting with providing with any organization, regardless of what area they may function in, tools to educate those who they interact with. Some of this sounds like old school, but I can tell you, particularly in immigrant communities, talk radio, programs that talk about different issues are ways in which people receive a lot of information these days with WhatsApp. So creating standardized materials that provide a same page understanding of what this is in a simple fashion, I think is not only helpful to increase awareness, but also provide a roadmap for people of what are those immediate steps they can take. At the end of the day, we need to increase awareness and understanding of what are some of the early signs, right, that tell us about the developing or escalating patterns on hate crimes, and working together to create easy access tools before something happens that also become helpful in tracking those patterns and trying to interrupt them.
Fantastic, Clarissa. Thank you, everyone. It is great to be back together. Clearly, the internet knows how important a conversation we're having. And just to let everyone know who is seeking CLE credit, we will extend the presentation so that you'll receive your full hour of credit. And I will make sure that you get your final code as well. But when we froze, some of us more awkwardly than others, according to my picture box, I was tossing John a question really about kind of at least my hopeful potential that the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act might really be of benefit. Or if there's silver linings coming out of COVID, maybe it's some of the intentionality that has gone into looking at what has gone on in this country outside of the medical crisis during this pandemic. Could you go a little deeper with us to tell us what you're seeing about potential coming out of the act?
Sure, absolutely. It's great to be back with everyone again. So to be clear, just to set everyone's framing around the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, this does not create a new hate crime. A lot of people, frankly, in my community, they're like, oh, this creates a new hate crime. It does not. But what it does do is allows for hopefully better reporting, incentivizing of that reporting. With respect to the Asian American community, establish an ombudsperson for which hate crimes can be reported for expedited treatment. It also allows for potential grants and mini grants to communities to help with the reporting. And it also starts to talk about doing some explorative work with respect to restorative justice and other models for addressing hate crimes. So there's a lot in there that I agree. I think it can lead to some wonderful things. And, I whenever I say this, and you could see that I pause when I talk about this, is it's great that it happened. And we're so proud of the work that everyone did. A big shout out to ADL for the work that you all did with respect to the Hate Crimes Act, because you led the charge with respect to the Jabbar higher portion of this before the efforts got merged together. And you led the charge also to stand up for other communities, even when, frankly, probably that act already had what it needed, so to speak, for the Jewish American community. But you all recognize that to be good allies, we all need to be part of this together. So thank you for that. And so, there's a lot in there to help all of our communities. But again, I want to be also very clear, it's just a start. There's still much more that needs to be done. And that's where, Cheryl, you talked earlier about state and local initiatives. I think this is where sort of that state and federal can be done in a good way together, so that the federal government has set up a certain framework, has set up certain grants that it can give out. Now, the hope is that the state government also sort of takes up that mantle to set up those infrastructure resources at those state levels.
John, makes a lot of sense, and thank you for giving us a lay of the land and for your kind words. You know that ADL's commitment to hate crimes has been longstanding purely because we believe that a crime against any one individual is a crime against a community. Until all of our communities have the ability to live freely in this country for who they are, none of us are truly free. And so I thank you. I thank you for your acknowledgement, but our work is surely not done on the Hate Crimes Act. And when we did 50 States Against Hate several years ago, really with the recognition that not only were there states, we're excited to add Georgia, to have recently added Georgia to the list of states with hate crimes. There's still others that we're working in arduously, and there's still many states where there's not complete coverage in state law, and we have plenty of work to do. I like to call it job security with our teams, a whole lot of work.
Yeah, and one thing I wanted to just mention, sorry to sort of intersect on this, but one of the reasons I hesitated when I started talking about this is just like, for our community, the fact that it took the murder of 6 Asian American women and 4 Sikh Americans to cause this to pass, right, is just tragic. It's just tragic. And, unfortunately, that's what it took in some ways. But I want to recognize that and acknowledge that, because I think if you think about why all of us are here talking to all of you and doing the work that we do, is to try to prevent further acts like that.
That's right. One of the things that I love about the theme for this entire conference, Never Is Now, is the calling back to never forget, from Elie Wiesel in the book Night, and the reminder that there are always these smaller indignities that happen up until violence ending in murder happens, where we're all just like, walking around our daily life like, oh, that sucks for them. Let's, keep on going with our everyday routine. And it too often takes the worst situations to happen for us to really grapple with where the seed of hate, ignorance, bias, stigma, where it all started from, right? And it's much easier to pull a weed when it's small than when it has become something that is about to take over your yard, to keep with my yard analogies today. And, you used the word interrupter earlier, and that's really what we all have to do, right? It's to really guard ourselves and remembering that we are all able to interrupt when we see situations of hate happen. And it can be a conversation, right? Where someone says something disparaging about another community, and being able to interrupt that is not okay and it's not funny, right? To something larger, interrupting when someone is starting to pick a fight, or to, crowd someone's personal space because of difference, right? We all have the ability to be able to do that interrupting, and our government has to always be on the side of interrupting. And there were some years in the last few years, before this last presidential election, where that certainty with our government wasn't there. And the thing that I appreciate about the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act that I don't think got as much coverage as it should have was the overwhelming bipartisan makeup of the vote. It wasn't we just squeaked by a filibuster-proof majority, right, to get it passed. There were over 70 U.S. senators, who from both parties, who said that rooting out what was beginning to be seen as okay because of 4 years of a government that turned the other way, moving in a direction where we're reminding people what we want to be as a country, in the direction that forward really pulls us to be with each other. So, thank you, John, for, lifting that up, and for everyone's work. Unidos US and ADL, and so many others not on this panel, and pushing the bill across the finish line.
Teamwork is required, I think, in all of. We were talking about that there are a rising number in the reports, but the number of agencies reporting is not rising. In fact, it flattens over time. And so, in your experience, I'd really like to understand, do you see that law enforcement understands when a hate crime is reported to them? What are you seeing in communities?
I think that the depth of understanding has to grow. And some may look at it as, hey, this is more for social organizations than for law enforcement. But I think that's where the depth of understanding is important. It's a little bit like preventive medicine, right? We have to get better at identifying the early signs. So as I mentioned earlier, so that we are able to interrupt those patterns before they reach violent consequences. And I would say that preventing violence in a community, preventing overt intimidation, if not the earlier signs, those things definitely are in the bailiwick of what law enforcement cares about in protecting and serving the communities in which they operate. So I think that's a partnership. There needs to be a partnership with local community to deepen cultural competence. And cultural competence isn't just about, a community speaks a different language or looks different than me. It's about What is the environment in a particular community that it's going to be different if you are in South Florida or in the Panhandle, right? It's that situational awareness and understanding what communities may feel comfortable with. In some ways, law enforcement has methods in this area. Is community policing, right? And it's growing the breadth of the things that are part of community policing and taking the best lessons from that. This is very much part and parcel of a similar strategy. But I think at the end of the day is, yes, increasing the tools and the awareness and the what is a hate crime and what are the first 5 things I need to do if I see or experience one, but also ensuring that on the receiving end, the entities that are collecting that information also know what information they need to collect. And I say this, right, coming from a multiracial community, the Latino community, where even if somebody were to report a hate crime, for example, the coding of that person may be recorded down as being white, for example, as opposed to being Latino, because we're multi. So depending on how the question is asked, you may completely lose or fail to detect a pattern depending on how you're collecting that. So as in so many areas, the data is not going to solve everything, but the data is important to inform the solutions. And as with the hate crime bill that we saw, also having legislation means that we have additional tools, and then we have to increase the access and the leveraging and the using of those tools so that they are worth having passed.
That's Clarissa. That's fantastic, the way you pulled those pieces together. And I'm now starting to see questions coming in. And I know that we've gotten your messages across to the audience, because the first question that I have for whomever or everyone to take is, we're convinced the numbers don't tell the story. What are the real numbers? I mean, John hit on it for us that the numbers coming out of the Asian community are almost laughable. He knows that they're so tiny that they're not meaningful. But our audience wants to know, do we have any insight to what the real numbers might be or how we could find them?
Well, part of being able to get the real numbers for the LGBTQ community is having consistent data collected for sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. And in a number of states and across the federal government, those data points aren't even being gathered. So if the question isn't being asked, it's impossible to really look at it. The other side of it is the intersections, right? So as an organization that does its work, across a few different multiply historically excluded communities, we want to be able to easily pull data to see what the hate crime stats look like in South Florida, right? For Black trans women. Currently, the way the data is presented at the state, local, and federal level, in most jurisdictions, it's very difficult to be able to see that profile. Now, I know, because for every single Black trans woman that dies in this country, that makes it, somewhat out of the bubble of the community, I put out a press release about every single one of their deaths. And so I know that the numbers aren't telling the full story, because I'm literally typing and telling the stories of these women whose lives have been taken unjustly, and too often the local law enforcement agencies and communities have done nothing to solve these crimes. Last year was a record, unfortunate record number of transgender people whose lives were taken due to hate, a vast majority of them being Black transgender women. And when you look at the number of cases that Department of Justice, even since the Matthew Shepard, James Byrd Act had passed, is less than one hand, right? And we have 50 plus that died last year. And again, over the course of the last 10 plus years, can only count to 2 to 3 that have actually been investigated and solved. So the data is not there. And where there is data, you can't pull it in ways that allow us to find the nuances of where there really are, ambulance, sirens going off that says, oh, we really need to go into this community and figure out what the cause is here so we can address it. But that is the vision forward, is to be able to have the data that tells the multiracial story and impact for the Latinx community, that provides evidence and better understanding across the various ethnic communities in the AAPI community, to have religious nuance so that we can see where there's anti-Semitism or Islamophobia or other kinds of anti-religious minority sentiments that we can better capture, right? And so that we can better see, where we are seeing spikes against the LGBTQ community across all of these different points, along with disability and class, which is not included, I don't know, in however many hate crimes law, you don't see class. And yet every day I walk out in DC, you can see a homeless person who is being victimized by people who have so much stigma against their community. So that's a whole other tangent I'm not going to go down. But, there are all these ways in which we need more data and we need more protections to send a loud and clear message that America doesn't stand for that.
Thank you, Victoria. Clarissa or John, any insight into where you think the real numbers are or how we could get to them? I think we'll put Victoria on that case completely. We probably have time for one more question. And this one really focuses us back on law enforcement. Asking about, in this country, we know that there can be unjust conduct by law enforcement towards marginalized individuals. Is there a system that's going to have protection in reporting of that?
One of the things that we called for in our policy recommendations is encouraging the Department of Justice to take the same approach with law enforcement agencies that aren't doing a good job of reporting and investigating and solving these crimes, as has been taken when it comes to police violence and racial biases that have ended up in a variety of cases, looking into these different departments for signs of repetition in terms of signs of there being systemic inequities being baked in. Those same kinds of investigations from the Department of Justice need to be happening as it relates to lack of response. In some cases, there are some agencies that we know don't do anything for transgender deaths at all when it happens, whatever the reason might be, where there's lack of knowledge, lack of understanding how misgendering and misrepresentation and dead naming impacts their ability to solve the crime, a whole host of reasons. And we believe that an existing law that was passed in the 1990s gives the Department of Justice already the ability to do this, and we're hoping that they do.
Thank you, Victoria. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, one thing I would add is recognizing the limitations of law enforcement. Part of the solution, again, is to think about how reporting can be done by healthcare, right? Mental health, physical health. Because, again, sort of coming at it, centering it with the victim, in many ways, the victim, they want accountability, but what accountability means varies by individual, right? What they definitely want is for their needs to be taken care of. So if we are interested in accurate reporting and better data, part of it has to be recognizing that the first responders are part of that solution, right? And not to minimize sort of the role that law enforcement can play. I mean, there certainly is a role that can be played, but if that's where we're relying on, if we're building the system around that, then we're always going to have gaps.
Without a doubt, John, I think you point out beautifully that this is an all-in, everyone has to be participating in this. A couple of questions that we're not going to have time for, but I want to pull them together because they hit the same thing, which is the distinctions between hate crimes and hate incidents. And of course, for CLE purposes, we're talking about the Shepherd-Bird Act, which is about hate crimes. And those are crimes qualified by the law with a bias-motivated intent. But I think in all of our discussions today that hate incidents, whether that's hateful attitudes, hateful acts that don't rise to the legal definition of a crime, are problematic in our society and build that foundation that lets everything elevate. And I want you all to touch on that too, if your remarks fit both or only hate crimes.
Sure, and for CLE purposes, it's also important to recognize that typically when we're talking about hate crimes, again, it's not typically a separate crime. It's a criminal enhancement onto a crime of assault or a crime of battery or any of these types of crimes. What happens is that if there is intent based on racial, religious, sexual orientation, animus, then you will get an enhanced criminal penalty. So that's one thing to recognize about how the law actually works, right? But then I think the other component to all of this is, even if it's also not a hate crime, especially for the lawyers out there, think about what other remedies are available, because there can very well be a discrimination claim that is made, right? There could be a civil lawsuit that is filed. And those all might be very important as well for the individuals that are involved in the case, the victims that are involved in the case. So even if it doesn't quote unquote, rise to the level of a hate crime, well, Victoria also expressed it beautifully, is we all know what happens is when you have an incident of hate that is left unchecked. That incident, a racial slur becomes a push or a shove, becomes, an actual punch, becomes a gun, right? And so we need to treat all of these similarly in a serious way.
Thank you so much, Victoria and Clarissa and John, not just for your time today, but for the work you're doing every day on this incredibly important issue impacting every single one of us across this country and across this world. I really, really appreciate it, and thank you for joining us. I want to apologize to our audience for the technical difficulties. Please scroll down and find a list of ways you can take action to fight hate against hate and anti-Semitism. Click on the full agenda button at the top of this page to see the full slate of panels from subject matter experts offered around the country this evening, tomorrow, and our amazing closing session tomorrow night. Add your voice on social media and tell us why you are fighting anti-Semitism and hate using the hashtag #NeverIsNow. I hope you will join us for our next panel, How Disinformation Campaigns Fuel Anti-Semitism and Extremism, that will begin in just a few moments at 4:30 p.m. Eastern. Thank you. Thank you for helping us fight hate for good.